When you think of the Middle Ages, you might picture brave knights, huge castles, and epic fights. There is, however, a darker truth behind the romanticized front, especially for women. In this time period, women were not just damsels in distress. They had to deal with a maze of problems, from social norms to severe humiliations. Being a woman in those rough times wasn't easy. So, come with us as we cover the messed up things that women in the medieval age went through. Sexual assault. During the Middle Ages, many women were sexually assaulted, which was a very sad fact of life. At that time, the way the law, society, and culture were thought about made it so that sexual violence was not only common, but also often accepted and even encouraged in different ways. For this time period, the idea of agreement as we know it today was not really present. In the minds of many women, their bodies were owned by their dads, and then by their husbands. This male-centered view included sexual liberty, or rather, the lack of it. As an example, raping a spouse was not a crime. It was thought that a husband had the right to access his wife's body as part of the marriage, so the idea of agreement didn't matter. Marriage by abduction was one of the scariest things that people did. Kidnapping a woman and forcing her to get married was a legal and socially acceptable way for a man to claim a wife. The marriage was only legal after consummation, which is the same thing as raping. People like Theobald F., Count of Blois, and Geoffrey, Count of Nantes, who tried to take Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the most beautiful woman in Europe at the time, were involved in high-profile cases. Women from lower social classes were also hurt by these cruel acts. It was often worse for them because they didn't have any social or legal safeguards. For example, Andreas Capellanus's works from the 1200s give us a disturbing look into how people thought and felt at that time. Capellanus said that peasants, who were thought to be unable to truly love, could be forced into sexual relationships through charm and force. This shows that men deeply believed that women were only objects of desire. Victims of rape didn't have many legal options, and getting help was hard. Some of the time, the victim was expected to do the punishment herself, like poking the wrongdoer in the eyes or cutting off his testicles. But these harsh punishments were rarely carried out. In many cases, the rapist just paid a fine or married the victim. This last result was especially sneaky because it forced the victim to stay close to her attacker for life, often to protect her family's honor or social standing. There was a right of the lord in some parts of feudal Europe that supposedly let a feudal lord sleep with a servant's bride on her wedding night. There is some disagreement about how historically accurate this practice is, but just bringing it up shows how unfair power relationships and abuse were in the Middle Ages. Some of these acts were also supported by religious groups. Women had to follow strict moral rules set by the church, which emphasized their roles as obedient wives and mums. In religious writings and teachings, the victims were often blamed for sexual violence because of how they behaved or looked. This not only kept many women from speaking out, but it also made people think that they were to blame for what their attackers did. Even though the chances were very bad, there were cases of resistance and reporting. Some women did report being raped, and there were cases where justice was sought, even though the system was very badly broken. History shows that some women were believed when they said what they said, and their claims were looked into. But for many others, getting justice was hard because of big social and legal problems. Witch hunts. People were very afraid of witches in the Middle Ages, targeting women more than men. This hysteria was at its worst between the 15th and 17th centuries. The most well-known cases, like the ones in Salem, happened much later, but the ideas behind them were planted in Europe in the Middle Ages. There were many things that led to these witch hunts, including superstition, religious zeal, and social problems. A big part of spreading fear of witches was done by the Catholic Church. Heinrich Kramer and James Sprenger wrote Malleus Maleficarum, also known as The Hammer of Witches, in 1487. It was a guide on how to find witches, question them, and put them to death. This book was a big hit and was used as a guide by witch hunts all over Europe. Witches were found using ways that were both cruel and made no sense. One way that was often used was the swimming test. People who were thought to be witches were tied up and thrown into water. If they floated, it was thought that they were refusing baptism and were therefore guilty. People thought they were innocent if they sank, but many of them drowned anyway. The accused was also pricked, which meant they were stabbed with needles to find a witch's mark, which was said to be a spot that didn't hurt or bleed. This could be anything from a mole to a lump on your skin. Once women were charged, they were subjected to harsh interrogations that were meant to get them to confess. People were often tortured. Some of the most terrifying ways to kill someone were the rack, in which their limbs were slowly pulled apart, and the strappado, in which their arms were tied behind their back and they were lifted. Many people admitted to anything just to end the pain they were in. There was a lot of social pressure and mental pain, even without torture. Women who were accused of witchcraft were shunned by their communities, and the shame often stayed with them even after they were found not guilty. Their families also suffered because they were shunned and suspected. It was not fair at all that the cases took place. People who said the accused person's spirit or spectre was seen performing witchcraft were often used as proof. This was completely biased and couldn't be shown to be false. Rumors, hearsay, and dreams could all be used against the person who is being charged. In a lot of cases, the hearings were just a formality that had to be done before the execution. Witches who were found guilty were given harsh punishments. Most people were given the death penalty, which was usually done by hanging or setting them on fire. Burning was especially cruel because people thought it would clean the soul. A lot of the time, these killings were done in public to scare other people. For a number of reasons, women were more likely to be accused. In their villages, they were often the healers, midwives, and herbalists, which meant they knew a lot about plants and natural remedies. In a culture full of superstitions, this information might be seen as witchcraft. Also, women who spoke out were financially independent or did other things that were different from social rules were easy targets. Widows and older women were especially at risk because they had less security and were less likely to have friends or family. The effects of these witch hunts were terrible. A huge number of women were killed and many more lived in fear. People in communities were torn apart by accusations and suspicions. The witch hunts strengthened patriarchal systems and kept women scared and subservient. Menstrual taboo. In the past, menstruation was often seen as a sign of being dirty and unsafe. People thought that menstrual blood could ruin food, spread diseases, and even cause crops to fail. Important people like Albertus Magnus, who said that menstrual blood was poisonous and dangerous, pushed these ideas even further. Women who were bleeding were then seen as scary and suspicious, which made them even more cut off from society. During their periods, women were often kept apart and told to stay away from group events and religious practices. They were shunned by society because they were thought to be dirty, which made the shame surrounding menstruation even worse in the Middle Ages. Having your period was often linked to going crazy and being unstable. Some books from the Middle Ages said that women were more likely to have emotional and mental problems when they were having their periods. This view turned a normal process into a disease and gave men an easy way to ignore and control women's actions and voices. It's interesting to note that ancient women didn't have periods as often as women do today. Many women had fewer monthly cycles because they didn't eat well, worked hard, or breastfed for a long time. Even so, when they did have their periods, it was especially hard because of how people treated them and the fact that they didn't get the care they needed. The church played a big part in keeping these taboos alive. Religious leaders often said that menstruation was a curse, which fed the idea that women were flawed and needed to be managed. This religious support for menstrual taboos made them more solid in medieval society and made sure they would last for generations to come. These problems were made worse by the lack of proper menstrual hygiene items. What women had to do was work with what they had. They used natural things like sphagnum grass, which soaked up a lot of liquid and helped control the flow of the period. Sphagnum moss, which is also called blood moss, was very helpful because it could soak up a lot of water. Women also made pads out of old clothes or rags. Even though cotton was hard to find and cost a lot, it was sometimes used because it was better at absorbing water. But linen was used more often because it was easier to get. Since most people didn't wear underwear yet, these cloth pads were often held in place with belts or bands. There is also proof that some women wore red clothes during their periods to hide any stains that might have happened. In addition to being stylish, red petticoats and skirts were useful because they covered up any menstrual leaks and lessened the social stigma that came with showing menstrual blood. Historians are still not sure about this behavior though, because it may not have been common or consistent. Aside from these options, some women in the Middle Ages also used natural materials as tampons. Soft and absorbent sea sponges were put in to soak up the menstrual flow. In rural places, women would sometimes just bleed into their clothes, trusting that the many layers of skirts and underwear would soak up the blood. These materials were painful and raised the risk of getting infections, which made periods even worse. During this time, women used simple ways to handle their periods, which is where the phrase "on the rag" comes from.
Accused of adultery. Adultery was seen as a terrible sin and a crime in many medieval countries, especially when it was done by women. Women who were accused of cheating were punished harshly and often in public. One usual punishment was to run. The accused woman had to walk or run through the streets while a town crier called out her crime. She was often only partly dressed or not dressed at all. The goal was to make her look bad in public so that other people wouldn't do the same thing. People often did this in the south of France, and the woman might even be abused by people watching her walk. In some places, the sentences were even worse. In Germanic cultures, if a husband caught his wife cheating on him, he could shave her head, strip her naked, and flog her through the town. There was also the chance of execution. The husband and sometimes her male cousins had the right to kill an adulterous wife if they caught her in the act. Because of the church's impact, these punishments were even worse. Extramarital sex was strongly forbidden by canon law, especially for women. As an act of penance, some women were sent to live in monasteries forever. This was often seen as a better sentence than being shamed in public or hurt physically. But many local courts liked to shame people in public to show the community what happened when people cheated on their partners. Men who had affairs with other women were not always punished as sharply. Women got harsh punishments, but men usually got lighter ones unless their cheating husband caught them in the act. Men could be flogged or given other physical punishments in these situations, but it didn't happen very often. The fact that these claims were often so weak made the injustice even worse. Women could be accused of adultery based on stories or suspicions that aren't true. These claims could be made out of personal grudges, jealousy, or just to make a woman look bad. Once someone was accused, it was very hard to prove they were innocent, and the social stigma that came with charges was terrible. The harshness of these sentences was linked to worries about property and wills. Adultery made heirs less likely to be legitimate, which made family assets less stable. Because people were worried about getting to know the father and keeping the family pure, women were punished the most for adultery. Lack of legal rights. In the Middle Ages, women were seen as the property of their dads or husbands, which made them very dependent on their men and gave them very little legal rights. In the first place, women didn't have many rights to property. When a woman got married, her land and wealth went to her new husband. She had to give up any land, money, or things she had made or inherited. The husband owned all of these things, and the wife had no formal right to them. If a woman lost her husband and his property, it often went to male cousins, leaving her without any money if her husband's will didn't provide for her. Marriage was mostly a business deal between families, and women often didn't have a say in the matter. Women were married off to make alliances, build wealth, or raise their social standing. The bride's main job was to have children and run the home. In these agreements, love and personal choice were not often thought about. When it came to the law, women were badly disadvantaged. They couldn't go to court on their own, and any legal issues had to be handled by their male cousins. Women's testimony was often seen as less reliable than men's, and in many cases,
They were not even allowed to speak. Women could hardly get justice or protect their rights because they didn't have lawyers to help them. Marriage was seen as a sacrament by the church, so divorce was very rare. If a woman was in a cruel or unhappy marriage, she didn't have many options. Annulments were not common, and the church usually had to step in. This was usually because of something that made the woman look bad, like charges of infertility or immorality. Society's expectations and religious teachings also had a big impact on women's jobs. Women were often seen as less moral and more likely to sin because of how the church influenced how people felt about them. This religious and cultural background made the social and legal limits on women make sense, supporting the idea that men should control and protect them. Even though these things were happening, some women were able to use the court system to their advantage. For instance, noble women could have a lot of power through their marriages and family ties. Some women also went to convents, which gave them some freedom and let them do educational things. All of these things did happen, but they were not the standard.
Forced into nuns. Imagine being sent away from your family and friends and having to follow strict rules and have few options. During the Middle Ages, this is what happened to many women because of pressures from family and society. One usual reason for forcing women to become nuns was to save money. Families with too many girls and not enough money for dowries often thought that nunneries would be a good idea. They saved money and knew their girls would be cared for by sending them to these religious schools, even if it meant living in a closed community. At that time, nunneries were the best places for women to get an education. Girls, some as young as 7, were sent to these places to learn how to read, write, and understand religious books. This may sound like a good thing, but the truth was often very bad. They didn't usually get to make the choice, and a lot of young girls were taken away from their families and had little to no contact with other people. Being a nun was not an easy life. The daily schedule was very strict. It started at around 2 a.m. with matins, the first service of the day, and continued with many prayer meetings and hard work all day. Some of the things they had to do were work in the fields, cook, embroider, and copy texts. Even though it was hard work, some women felt like they had some control and a reason for doing these things. For many, though, it was a life of never-ending work. Forcing women to become nuns wasn't always done for financial reasons. There were also important social and political reasons for this. For example, some noble families sent their girls to nunneries to keep them pure and protect the family's honor, or to get rid of a possible political threat. In some cases, girls were sent away because they were thought to be shameful or to settle family arguments. This method sometimes made nunneries too crowded. In 1273, for example, the prioress of Caro said that powerful lords were forcing their girls to live in the convent, which was too many for the building to handle. Nunneries were very strict places where women had to live a life of chastity, poverty, and submission. Nuns wore simple clothes like a long tunic and a hood to show that they gave up material things and were devoted to God. There wasn't much contact with the outside world, and leaving the nunnery was almost impossible without bad things happening. Even though it was hard, some women did find comfort and purpose in the walls of the convent. They did things like volunteer work, taught, and even some intellectual pursuits. But the fact that they were forced to go to these schools often overshadowed the good things about them, making many women feel trapped in a life they didn't choose. Guild exclusion. Guilds were strong groups of traders and craftsmen who worked together to control trade, keep quality high, and protect their members' social security. But they also had strict rules that women couldn't follow, so they couldn't get these perks and chances. In most guilds, women were not allowed to become full members or masters of their skills. Because of this, women were not allowed to legally own businesses, hire apprentices, or take part in how groups made decisions. Women had a hard time joining guilds and getting the benefits that came with it, even in jobs where women were very involved, like making textiles, cooking, and being a midwife. Guilds didn't respect or recognize the work that women did in fields like spinning, weaving, and brewing, even though they often did it with men. When women were able to work in these trades, it was usually as unskilled workers or in support roles that paid less and were less secure. When it came to the textile business, for example, women worked in lower status jobs like spinning and fine needlework, while men did the more lucrative jobs like making clothes. In some places like Paris and Genoa, there were exceptions. For example, there were guilds for women who worked in skills like making silk and spinning gold. Although these did happen, they were not common and did not really change how most groups in Europe excluded people. The top positions in these groups for women were still mostly held by men, and women still had a lot of restrictions. Widows had a slightly better chance of taking part in group activities because they could take over the business rights that their husbands owned. This let some women carry on the jobs their late husbands had and even become somewhat independent. But this was usually only possible if they didn't get married again, because then their new husbands would have power again. Widows who were able to keep their guild rights usually had to follow a lot of rules and be closely watched by male guild members. Limited access to education. In the Middle Ages, it was hard for women to get an education. People didn't think women needed to go to school as much back then, so most girls didn't get the chance to learn like boys did. Most people thought that a woman's place was at home, taking care of the house and the kids. That's why many girls were taught housework instead of reading and writing. Noble women had a little more luck. They learned to read, write, and run farms while sometimes going to school at home. But even for them, the focus wasn't on school subjects, but on learn how to run a family. For instance, they might learn some math to help them manage their money, or Latin to read religious books, but they weren't usually pushed to do more. Peasant women, on the other hand, didn't have many chances to go to school. From working in the fields to taking care of the house, they spent their whole lives working hard. Every day for these women was about staying alive, so they didn't have much time or space for school. They didn't have the money to read or write as a treat. In those days, the only places where some women could go to school were monasteries and convents. At that time, nuns were some of the smartest people in the world. They knew how to read and write Latin, copy old books, and sometimes even teach other women. However, this schooling was mostly limited to religious texts and didn't cover other topics. Hildegard of Bingen, a German Benedictine abbess, was one of the few well-known cases. She wrote, composed, thought deeply, and had a clear goal. Hildegard did a lot of amazing things, but she was very much the exception rather than the rule. When given the chance, her story shows that women could do great things, but those chances were very rare. Women weren't getting enough schooling for more than one reason. It also meant that women didn't have many chances to change society or get ahead in society. They couldn't take part in academic or political debates, write books, or help make scientific findings if they weren't educated. This exclusion kept a cycle of ignorance and abuse going. For women, education didn't get much better until the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. People like Christine de Pizan started to question the way things were. Christine was a writer who pushed for women to go to school and said that if given the same chances, women were just as capable as men. Some of the ideas in her writings helped start the women's rights organizations that came after. Childbirth dangers. In the Middle Ages, giving birth was very dangerous for women. Giving birth was dangerous because people didn't know much about medicine, didn't clean up well, and couldn't get to the right care. First, let's talk about how diseases can be dangerous. There was a higher chance of getting puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, when women gave birth at home or in dirty places. Without clean tools and medicines, this bacterial infection could spread very quickly. These infections killed a lot of women just days after giving birth. Problems with giving birth were another big problem. Obstructed labor is one problem that could kill both the mother and the baby if it is not treated with modern medicine. Midwives and birth attendants didn't have a lot of tools or information to handle these kinds of situations. For example, if the baby was in a breech position, it was very unlikely that either the mother or the child would live. Another very dangerous risk was bleeding. Without blood transfusions or more advanced medical methods, women who bled too much during or after giving birth often died. In the Middle Ages, doctors didn't have the tools to treat serious bleeding, so many women would bleed to death with little or no help. The high death rates were also caused by a lack of pregnancy care. Women didn't have access to regular checkups to keep an eye on their own and their kids' health. Conditions like preeclampsia, which causes high blood pressure and can cause seizures or strokes, were not always found or handled because of this. For pregnant women, nutrition was very important to their health. During the Middle Ages, many women did not have access to enough food, which could make pregnancy and childbirth more difficult. Their bodies were weaker because they didn't eat well, which made them more likely to have problems and less able to heal from giving birth. It was almost impossible to deal with pain during labor. Women were in unbearable pain because they didn't have access to modern drugs. The stress and fear that come with giving birth could also make labor worse, which could lead to more problems. Also, the high number of babies made these risks even worse. Women were often expected to have a lot of children, and this could begin as early as their teens. The constant loop of being pregnant and giving birth hurt their bodies a lot. The risks went up with each new birth because of the damage caused by having multiple pregnancies without enough time to heal. Sadly, stillbirths and baby deaths were very common. A lot of kids didn't make it through the birthing process or died soon after because they got infections, were born early, or were born with problems. Women who had lost a child had to deal with a lot of physical and mental pain.
Sumptuary laws. During the Middle Ages, sumptuary laws were rules that were put in place by the government to control the use of expensive goods, especially clothes. The goal of these laws was to keep social orders strong and stop people from spending too much money. They also made sure that people dressed appropriately for their social standing. The rules about sumptuary were especially harsh on women. Women had to follow these rules about what colors, fabrics, and even decorations they could wear. As an example, only noble women were allowed to wear silk, satin, or fur. A woman from a lower class could be severely punished if she was seen wearing these things, such as being fined and shamed in public. Different parts of the country had different rules, but the goal was always the same: to stop people from dressing too fancy for their social rank. The people who enforced sumptuary rules were often harsh and mostly went after women. It was okay for a noble woman to show off her money and power, but it was frowned upon for a common woman to try to do the same. Because of this double standard, it was hard for women to express themselves through fashion because they had to wear only what was acceptable for their class. Not only did these rules cover clothes, they also covered other parts of a person's appearance, like hairstyles and jewelry. For example, in England in the late 1400s, it was against the law for lower-class women to wear gold or silver braiding and to wear their hair in complicated styles with jewels. Laws about sumptuary were often strictly enforced. People who break the rules could get fined a lot of money or even have their fancy clothes taken away. In the worst cases, like when servants disobeyed these rules, they were punished by being publicly flogged. Sumptuary rules show how far people in the Middle Ages went to keep society running smoothly and control how women behaved. These rules were used to oppress women because they limited their freedom and kept the rigid social order that controlled their whole lives in place.